A couple of days ago, I saw an article that was quite possibly the worst take on the protests in Portland, in particular, the tactics that are being used, where protesters here are choosing to keep Portland weird, where we are choosing to lean in to whimsy, to levity, to humor, to ridicule. Portlanders are now iconic for dressing up in inflatable costumes. I mean, really, it started with that guy in the chicken suit handing out cookies, shouting at Kristi Noem, "Come down here and hang out with me. I'll buy you a Subway sandwich." There's a brass band in banana suits. There's grannies having a knit-in. There's folks showing up with their footy pajamas having breakfast protests. There were people who dressed up in period costume and had a high tea. Kids doing the cha-cha slide. Right, like this is what protests look like in Portland.
President Trump will end the radical left's reign of terror in Portland once and for all.
You look at Portland and you see fires all over the place. You see fights and just violence.
This network of Antifa is just as sophisticated as MS-13, as TDA, as ISIS, as Hezbollah, as Hamas, as all of them. They are just as dangerous. They have an agenda to destroy us, just like the other terrorists we've dealt with for many, many years.
There's way more silliness where that came from, right? We are being true to ourselves. We are keeping Portland weird. In fact, the other day there was an emergency naked bike ride protest here in Portland. I saw Heather Cox Richardson even mentioned it today. She's like, I think there's some kind of history there, some kind of subculture that people outside of Portland are not really aware of the symbolism and the meaning. The Portland naked bike ride is a proud tradition in our city. So the fact that there was an emergency naked bike ride to protest ICE and hundreds of people showed up on a rainy October day. Yeah, Portlanders are being true to ourselves. And not only that, but we're using really effective tactics to undermine the regime, which is why I was so frustrated to see this like just ridiculously bad, embarrassingly bad article put out by The Verge a couple of days ago. And I think they're like a tech publication. I don't know why they felt that they should wade in here at all, but they should have just zipped it, kept it quiet, deferred to people who actually know what the fuck they're talking about. Yes, I'm getting a little bit worked up. I actually got so worked up that when I saw this on Facebook, I left a little comment. I said, this is a terrible take from someone who clearly doesn't understand the power of ridicule, the power of levity and humor, the power of nonviolence. Okay, don't read that second part. We're going to get to it in a second. Because the title of this piece in The Verge is American Politics Has Devolved into Shitposting and Aura Farming. The author is Sarah Zhang, who is a lawyer and a journalist. Apparently, she's been writing about tech for 10 years and is sets herself up as an expert on law, tech, and internet subcultures. But she's clearly not an expert about nonviolent direct action, nor about successful organizing and tactics to topple authoritarian regimes. I'm not usually so highly critical, but I thought this piece was absolute garbage. It starts out with her having this disdainful take of the Portland frog, right? This kid who became famous for showing up in an inflatable frog costume. By the way, I think Jordan Klepper interviewed him yesterday or today, so I look forward to seeing that interview when it comes out. But basically, he showed up at the protest in an inflatable suit. This is after there have been other folks showing up in chicken suits, Lilo and Stitch outfits, all kinds of silly costumes, and I'll get into the strategic choice to do that in just a moment. But this video goes viral of a kid in an inflatable frog suit walking forward and all of these ICE agents and all of their body armor obscuring their identities backing up as this frog walks forward. And then they get onto ICE property and he stands there and he just air humps them, for lack of a better term. Right, the article describes it this way. After the frog humped the air in front of a throng of federal law enforcement, many dressed in head-to-toe camo with military-grade helmets, gas masks, and riot shields, the feds slowly began to retreat. What else could they do? A soldier knows what to do when they encounter another soldier, but an air-humping frog? Girlfriend, why are you describing the Proud Boy oath keeper, poorly trained chuddies that make up the American Gestapo known as ICE? Why are you describing those guys as soldiers? Why are you making them sound like legitimate trained members of our armed forces? Right? Already I take issue with your article. So she goes on to say the frog is ludicrous. The frog makes no sense. The frog is a viral symbol of the resistance against the Trump regime and the key to understanding what happened to discourse in the second Trump presidency. She goes on to describe the frog and other protesters like him as intentional inanity. I don't mean satire. Satire turns meaning on its head. Even when it is absurd, it has a reference point and a message. The author seems to also take issue with the frog being interviewed by K2 News, where they said, I don't want to see anybody treated inhumanely, and they called ICE agents immature for trying to spray pepper spray into their vent of their suit. Right, that video has gone insanely viral. In an extremely dangerous and unprovoked act, an ICE agent tried to spray pepper spray directly into the vent of the frog's suit. And the very next day, he was right back out there protesting. Continuing in her rather disdainful tone when referencing protesters here in Portland, Sarah says most politics is now split between two internet-poisoned types of behavior, aura farming and shitposting. Aura farming is an earnest attempt to look cool. She goes on to say shitposting is incoherence in the form of humor, a sort of nihilism that refuses to engage with meaning, words, or reality. Shitposting is a mockery of seriousness, but because it is so incoherent, it has little to no effect on normal people behaving normally. She goes on to reference the guy in the chicken suit, who I have met and is a delightful human being and a dedicated and sophisticated protester, using very clever and effective tactics. She goes on to describe him as a shitposter. Sarah says the frog is the best thing to happen to American politics all year, but the fact that politics have devolved into shitposting is ultimately a bad thing. Any other increasingly authoritarian state, I would assume that the politics of shitposting would eventually collapse under the weight of all that militarization. You can't keep posting through it when there's no internet and memes are illegal. She goes on to say that the Trump regime is so bent on aura farming itself that she thinks shitposters will continue to win against the Trump regime as long as Trump and his minions are incapable of behaving normally. I hated this article. I hated it. I think the author was desperate to have her little thesis of shitposting and aura farming and the contrast between the two and how it's the devolution of American politics. But that assertion is absolutely showing her complete and total ignorance of the strategy and tactics, the thoughtfulness, the planning, and the efficacy of what Portlanders are doing. We know that humor and ridicule, using absurd tactics, leaning into levity and whimsy, all of that creates a contrast between the brutality, the extremity, the illegality of the regime and the protesters themselves. It also does a fantastic job of undercutting and disproving the lies of the regime. The regime is claiming that Portlanders are all violent Antifa extremists, domestic terrorists, and that we are waging war, that it's a war zone, it's hell on earth here. The tactics that we here in Portland are using, starting with kids like that young man in a chicken suit. I don't know if I can say his real name. I don't know if his name is known. When you dress up in a chicken suit and you hand out cookies, when you wear an inflatable frog costume and you're air humping ice, us here in Portland being silly and lighthearted and using these tactics, it is pointing out how absolutely absurd, false, unhinged, and completely disconnected from reality the claims of the regime are. Nobody thinks fairies in tutus blowing bubbles, folks playing trumpets in banana suits, guys in chicken suits challenging Kristi Noem to go get a Subway sandwich with him, are violent extremists that require the use of the military to restore peace to Portland, Oregon. The fact that all of that was a big whoosh for this author, to me says, one, she should go read about effective nonviolent resistance tactics. The power of the symbols that we are creating, the meaning that we are creating through the strategies that we are using here in Portland. How we are gaining control of the narrative and doing tremendous work to undermine the regime. Seriously, stick to writing about tech, girlfriend. Portland is going to keep doing what we're doing. It may be going over your head, but the American public understands. Our strategy here is working incredibly well. And we'll all be out in the streets on October 18th.